Hey everyone, and welcome back to Daily Tuition. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can create this beautiful application using MongoDB, Express, React, and Node. I'm going to show you how you can easily make this MERN Stack expense tracker application. I'm also going to cover the front end and the back end of this application. Let me show you a very quick demo of this application. Here I'm going to have the header expense tracker, and then on the right side here we have the transaction form. Using this form, you create a new transaction. So for example, if I say salary here, if I add salary, and this is a type of saving. So if I choose here saving, and if I add $300, when I click on this make transaction, you can see I'm going to get here a donut chart. And inside this donut chart, we have 100% of salary data. If I add here another data, for example, if I add my electricity bill, and this is in the expense category, and if I add $200, and when I make a request, you can see in the history we have electricity bill, the transaction name, and I'm going to get here two labels, saving and expenses. And now if I add another transaction here, if I add buy stocks for investment, if I select investment here, and if I buy stock of $100, when I click on this make transaction, I'm going to get 3 transactions inside this history and get 3 labels. If I deposit some money, and I'm going to choose the saving category, and if I deposit $150, when I click on this make transaction, then you can see the saving is now 60%, expenses is 27%, and investment is only 13%. And you will get all the transaction inside this history section. Just like that, if you want to delete any transaction, you can easily delete that with this trash button. So for example, if I click on this electricity bill trash icon, that will going to remove that transaction from this list. And now you can see, now the expenses is only 39%. That's exciting, right? So before wasting your too much time, let's get started. So let's get started and see how to make this beautiful expense tracker using React.js. Now I'm using Visual Studio Code Editor to create this complete project. So I'm going to first install the Visual Studio Code Editor and open empty folder inside it. Here you can notice I have here a tutorial folder. Now just like that, inside this tutorial, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to name that folder exp tracker. That's upon you, you can specify any name to this folder. Inside this, I'm going to create 2 folders, one for the client and second for the server. So here I'm going to create 2 folders, one for the client and second for the server. I'm going to create my React application inside this client folder, and I'm going to create the Express application, or you can say the backend of this application, inside this server folder. So let me first make the front end of this application. So I'm going to select the client, and inside this, I'm going to create the React application. To create a React app, as you know, you have to open your terminal. Let me clear the screen. And I'm going to first cd, enter into my expenses tracker. And inside that, I have client folder. I'm going to enter into my client folder, you can notice. And then I'm going to execute a command called npx create React app. And then I'm going to specify the project name. As you can see, I already have the client name to this project. So instead of specifying any project name, here I'm going to specify dot, because I want to create the React application inside my current folder, means inside this client folder. So I'm going to pass here dot and press enter. So this is going to install the React application inside this client folder. So it will take few minutes to create the whole React project inside this client folder. Now once you have your React project, you have to start this command to start the development server of React. You have to just say npm start. So this is going to start the development server of React. So if you open the client folder, you can see inside this client, you have the React application. Now what you have to do is you have to first clear the screen and specify a command called npm start. So this command is going to start the development server and run this React application inside a browser. So make sure you have browser in your system. My React app is running on localhost 3000. Now let me just toggle this window on the left side, something like this. Let me close this terminal because we are not using it. Now as you know, when you open the client folder, you can see you have the React project. I hope you already know the basics of React. If you don't know about React.js, then I have a complete course on it. Make sure you watch that course and then move to this tutorial. Because in this tutorial, I'm not going to cover the basics of React. I will put the link in the description as well as on the top right corner of the screen. Now, just out of that, inside the source folder, as you know, you have the app.js component. Let me get rid of all the code right from here. And I'm going to say here h1 and say expense tracker. Let me save this. So this will just remove all the unwanted code. And then I'm going to have the h1 heading tag. Now, just out of that, I'm going to install the Tailwind CSS to use the predefined CSS for this application. So let me open a new tab and search for Tailwind CSS. I'm going to open the Tailwind website. So I'm going to click on this tailwindcss.com and click on this Get Started. Now, to install Tailwind CSS, you have to install the Tailwind CSS library. And after that, you have to create a configuration file and configure the Tailwind CSS. Now, once you open the Tailwind CSS, just click on the framework guide and then click on the create React app, the React application, and then you have the installation of the Tailwind CSS in your React application. So what you have to do is you have to first make the React application. We already have that. Enter into your project directory. We are already in the project directory. And then you have to install Tailwind CSS, post CSS, and auto prefixer. So let's execute this command inside a terminal. So I'm going to open my terminal and open a new terminal. I have to first enter into my project directory. I'm going to say here cd expense tracker client. I'm going to first enter into my project directory and then execute a command called npm -install -d, and then I'm going to install Tailwind CSS, post CSS, and auto prefixer. So I'm going to install all these three libraries inside the React application. I'm going to press enter to install all this library in the React app. Now, once you install all these libraries, let me clear the screen, and you have to just specify here a command called npx tailwind css init-p. Now, this command is going to configure the Tailwind CSS application. So if you open your React app, then you can notice you don't have any Tailwind configuration file. So this command is going to create that file. So if I press enter in my terminal, then you can notice this is going to create Tailwind CSS and the post CSS file. You don't have to worry about this post CSS file. Just close this and open the Tailwind configuration file. Inside this file, what you have to do is you have to add this statement inside this content. So inside the content array, you have to add here this statement, this one. That's it. Now after that, you have to add the Tailwind directives. So you can use Tailwind base classes, component classes, and utility classes. So you have to just copy this code and put that in the CSS file. So I'm going to just close this terminal, open my React project. Make sure you save this file, Tailwind configuration file, close this, open the app.css, and here at the top, right up here, I'm going to paste this code, this one. Now, let me save these changes, and now you're ready to start. Now you can use Tailwind CSS in your project. Now, just for that, I want to use my own font family inside this project. So I'm going to just copy a font from Google Font. So I'm going to say here, Google Font. And from this Google Font website, I'm going to copy a font, which is Poppins, this one. I'm going to select the regular style, regular 400. I'm going to copy this, import statement, something like this, and specify that right here after the Tailwind configuration. And just out of that, I'm going to select all the descendant element using CSS selector, and then I'm going to specify this font family to it. So for all the elements, I'm going to have this font family. Just out of that, I'm going to say margin, which is going to be 0, and padding is going to be 0. So I will remove margin and padding from all the descendant elements. Let me save this, close this Poppins and this Tailwind. Now you can see I'm going to have this font family to this text. Just for that, let me create two variables here. Now I'm using my custom colors as well as the Tailwind colors. So let me add here two colors, which is my custom color. So I'm going to say here root, and inside this root, I'm going to create color yellow, something like this. And then I'm going to specify the hex value here of yellow color. After that, I'm going to say color purple. And then I'm going to specify the purple hex value to this root. So now I can use both these colors inside my project very easily. Let me save this. Scroll down here to this app. I'm going to specify padding, which is 4 EM to the top and bottom and 0 for the left and right. So that will add padding to this expenses tracker. After that, let me use both these variables. So let me get rid of all these code right from here. Let me get rid of this unwanted code. And here I'm going to say BG yellow. So this class is used to specify background color to the JSX element. So I'm going to say here color yellow. After that, I'm going to say dot BG purple. And this class is used to specify background color purple. Let me save this. Back to the app.js. Let me get rid of this unwanted logo from this project. Something like this. So now I can use Tailwind CSS in my project. Now, once I have the project structure, let me initialize this project as a Git repository. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to initialize this project, this expenses tracker, as a Git repository. So I'm going to add Git branches to every section so you can easily follow along with me throughout this course. So let me first initialize this expense tracker as Git repository. I'm going to open my terminal, clear the screen, and enter into my exp tracker. Something like this. So now I'm in my expenses tracker folder. Let me initialize this as Git repository. To do that, I'm going to say git init. Make sure you have Git installed in your local system so you can execute this command. So now this expenses tracker is now initialized with Git repository. And just for that, we have to add all this folder and its files inside the Git repository. But what we have to do is, we have to skip this node modules folder because inside that we have a bunch of libraries. We have to skip this node modules. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to create .gitignore file in this exp tracker. So here in the exp tracker, I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to say here .gitignore. And inside this file, let me copy all the code from the React project Git file and paste that here. Something like this. And just out of that, I'm going to just specify here client, because as you know, we have the node modules folder inside a client. So I'm going to specify here client. I'm going to copy this, paste it down here, and don't forget to remove this client and specify here server, because I'm doing the same thing with server as well. Now just out of that, if you want, you can specify your client and server to all these folders as well. That's upon you. Now let me save this, close this gitignore, and let me open my terminal. Now just for that, what I have to do is, I want to remove Git from this React folder. As you know, React is automatically going to initialize the React project as Git repository. So let me just first remove the Git repository from the React project. I'm going to say cd client, and once I enter into the client folder, I'm going to say here remove file, which is going to be Git. When I press enter, this is going to remove the Git file from the client, means from the React project. Once I've done that, let me clear the screen, enter into my expenses tracker, something like this, and then I'm going to say here git add space dot. So this will add all the files in the Git repository. Now just out that, we need to commit all these changes. So we need to say here git commit -m, and then I'm going to specify command which is initial project, and then I'm going to press enter. So now this is going to add all this code inside the master branch. You can notice I'm going to transfer the same code inside a project structure branch. So we have to just change this branch. So I'm going to say here git checkout -b, and then I'm going to pass the branch name. So I'm going to first specify project structure. So this is going to create a new branch and enter into that branch. So now when you clone the project with master branch, you will get the default configuration of this project. Now just for that, let me create a simple header for this expense tracker. So let me just add here a container, which is the Tailwind container. And inside that, I'm going to put this h1 heading tag. Let me save this and let me restart my application. So let me stop the React development server and start it again with npm start command. So this is going to start the React application on localhost 3000. You can notice. Now, as you can see, we have the expense tracker of Tailwind CSS. I'm going to specify here mx auto to center all the content. After that, we specify the maximum width, which is going to be max w and 6xl. You can find this class in Tailwind. I have a complete course on Tailwind CSS. If you want to know more about Tailwind, I have a complete course on it. You can check out that course from the top right corner of the screen or from the description. Now, just for that, I'm going to say text center to center all the text. Then I'm going to drop some shadow. So I'm going to say drop shadow LG, and then I'm going to say text gray 800. Now, just for that, let me specify classes to this h1 heading tag. So I'm going to specify here class name text for XL. So this will increase the size of this font family. You can notice. Then I'm going to say padding by 8. So this will add top and bottom padding. Then I'm going to specify margin bottom 10. This will add bottom margin to this expense tracker. And then I'm going to add here BG slate 800. So this will add background color to this expenses tracker. Just after that, I'm going to say here text white and rounded. So this is going to specify light color to this expenses tracker and then specify the rounded border. Inside this expense tracker, I'm going to create two columns. First for the graph, second for the form. So user can add their expenses and savings inside that form. So I'm going to create here a grid. So let me add here a comment and say grid columns. So I'm going to add here division tag with the class grid. You don't have to create all these classes because you will have all these classes in Tailwind. I'm going to add one column for the small devices, and after the medium devices, I'm going to add two columns. So for that, I'm going to say MD medium device. On medium device, I want grid calls 2. I want 2 columns from the medium devices and so on. And after that, I'm going to say gap 4. So this will add a gap between both the columns. Now, just for that, here, I'm going to first add graph, or you can say chart. And then after that, I'm going to add form. So let's take a look at how we can make this chart component inside this React application. Now let's get started and see how to make this chart component. I'm going to create a new folder inside the source to create different components. So I'm going to say here components. I'm going to name this folder components, and inside this, I'm going to create a new file with the name graph.js. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this component. Inside this graph.js, I'm going to create a React functional component. I already have an extension inside this VS Code which allows me to create a simple React component. So I'm going to say RFC and press enter. So this is going to create a functional React component. Now let me save this back to the app.js, and then right here I'm going to add my graph.js. So let me first grab the component. So I'm going to say here import graph from component graph.js. So let me copy this, paste it down here and press tab. So this will add the graph component in my application. You can notice. Just after that, I'm going to open the graph.js here. Instead of this division tag, I'm going to add here a div with different classes. So let me first add here a div with the class flex. Inside this graph, I'm going to create a flex box, and then I'm going to specify flex justify content Then I'm going to specify max width, XS, and MX auto to center all the content. After that, right here, I'm going to create the item division tag. And inside this item division tag, I'm going to create another div with chart class. So this is my flex item. And to this chart, I'm going to specify relative Tailwind class. Just so that inside this division tag here, I'm going to add my graph, or you can say I'm going to add my chart. Let me save this. Now, just out of this chart, right down here, I'm going to create another flex. And this time, I'm going to specify here flex column. So I'm going to put all the content of this div vertically. And then I'm going to specify padding 510. So this will specify top and bottom padding. And gap is going to be 4. So this will add a gap between the flex items. And here I'm going to add my label component. So let me add here labels. I'm going to create labels after a few minutes. Just for now, let me add here a comment labels. Let me save the changes. And just out of that, instead of this chart, I'm using chart.js library to add chart in my project. So let me just head on to chart.js website. I'm going to search for chart.js and click on the chartjs.org website. From this website, you can add different charts in your application. So just click on get started. You have different ways to install this chart in your React application. I'm using npm. So just click on npm and you have to execute a command called npm install chart. So just open a new terminal, enter into your client directory. So I'm going to say here cd client, and then you have to execute a command called npm install chart.js. So we are installing the chart.js library in the React project. Once we have that, we are using a chart Doughnut, this one. If you want, you can choose any chart type from this section. That's upon you. If you want to add a bar chart, you can choose the bar chart as well. You have bubble chart, Doughnut chart, line chart, and you have different chart options here. So that's upon you. You can add different charts inside your project. I'm choosing the Doughnut chart. And as you can see, to use this chart, you have to first configure the type, which is Doughnut, and then you have to pass data to it. And when you click on the setup, you can see you have to pass few data to this Doughnut. You have here labels, data set with label, data, and background colors. As well as we have hover effect here. You can notice when you hover on this graph, you have the hover effect. Now once you install this library in the project, just close the terminal, and at the top, here you can say import. In the curly braces, you can specify chart from, and then you can specify chart.js. So from the chart.js, we are getting the chart class. After that, we have to register a chart, as well as we have to call the chart component as well. Now, if you open the get started, and if you click on this get started button, you can see we have a canvas which we have to add to install, or you can say add chart in the project. As you know, we are not using vanilla JavaScript. Instead, we are using the chart.js React component. So what we are going to do is, I'm going to open my client, and then I'm going to say npm install React chart.js 2, the latest version of this chart.js library. I'm going to install this library. Inside this library, we have different components. Let me clear the screen, close this terminal, and right here at the top, I'm going to say import Doughnut from React chart.js 2. And then instead of this chart, I can just simply pass here this Doughnut. Let me back to my website, save the changes. And right now, I'm not going to get anything because we need to pass data to this Doughnut. So what we have to do is just click on this chart type, click on the Doughnut, and scroll down. Here you can find this data. You have to just copy this, paste that in your website, something like this. And then you have to pass this data over here, something like this. And now once you've done that, when you pass data to this Doughnut, when you save the changes and reload the browser, you're not going to get anything because you're going to have an error inside a console. ARC is not a register element. So what you have to do is you have to register this donut as ARC element. So at the top, you have to add here ARC element. And then just down here, you have to say chart dot register. And what you have to register is ARC element. Something like this. Let me save the changes. And now, if you reload the browser, you can see you have your donut chart. That's super easy, right? To add the donut chart in the application. Now, just out of that, I want to customize this donut chart. So what I'm going to do is, instead of these default values, I'm going to pass my own values. Or you can say, I'm going to pass the customization properties. Let me get rid of these labels. Something like this. And this label property as well. Just out of that, I'm going to create here a constant config object. And inside this object, I'm going to pass this data. So I'm going to create here a data property and pass an object here. And inside that object, I'm going to pass this data set. Something like this. And let me get rid of this constant data. And just out of that, just out of this data, right down here, I'm going to pass here options. And using this option, I'm going to pass cutout to this donut. Here I'm going to pass cutout 115. Let me save this. Oops, data is not defined. Now because we just renamed the data with config, we need to pass here config. And once we've done that, as you know, we are not passing only data. We are passing options as well. So instead of passing here another property like options and then pass this object to it, I'm going to get rid of both these properties and pass here curly braces, pass here spread operator, something like this, and I'm going to pass my config here. So now I initialize two properties with the same object. I initialize the data property and the option property of this donut. Let me save this. You can see I'm going to have the cutout. After that, let me add here border radius. So after this hover offset, I'm going to add here border radius. And this is going to be 30. When I save the changes, you can see I'm going to have this border radius. After that, I'm going to add here a spacing, which is 10. Now you can see my donut is completely ready. You can see how easy it is to create this beautiful donut in the React application. Now, just for that, once we have the donut, inside this donut, I want the title. So to add title inside this donut, just out of this donut here, I'm going to add h3 heading tag and then specify total here. And then I'm going to specify here some classes. So class names is equal to margin bottom 4, font is going to be bold, and title, my custom class. And just out of that, right down here, inside this h3 heading tag, right here, I'm going to add a span tag and specify here 0. And then I'm going to specify here some class names. So I'm going to specify here block text 3xl. Then I'm going to specify text emerald 400 to specify color to this text, something like this. And then I'm going to add here $sign. Just for that, what I want to move this h3 heading tag at the center of this donut. To do that, I'm using CSS file. So I'm going to back to the app.css. Right here, I'm going to say .chart .title. I'm going to select the h3 heading tag, and then I'm going to first specify position relative, then specify left is going to be 0, right is going to be 0, and top is going to be 40%. Then I'm going to specify margin left auto and margin right auto. Oops, I think I misspelled here. It's absolute. Let me save the changes, and now you can see we have the total at the center of this donut. Next, let me show you how you can create these labels inside this application. Now, just for that, once we understand how you can make this beautiful donut inside this React application, let me show you how you can create labels. So let me just close both these tabs, and inside my components right here, I'm going to create a new file with the name labels.js. And inside this file, let me create a React functional component, something like this. And back to the graph.js, close this app, and at the top here, let me import labels from labels.js. So I'm going to just import this labels component inside the graph. Let me copy this, paste that here, something like this, and then I'm going to press tab. So this will add the label component. You can see I'm going to have the label component at the bottom of this chart. Let me close this app.css, back to the label.js, and here I'm going to create a label for this application. So instead of creating a label inside this return statement, I'm going to create a function for that, so I can iterate over different labels. So here I'm going to say function label component, and inside this I'm going to return JSX. So here I'm going to say div with labels class, and to this div let me specify Tailwind classes. So I'm going to say here flex and justify between. After that, inside this div, here I'm going to create another div with flex class again, and then I'm going to specify here gap 2. So I'm going to add some gap between two different flex component, and just for that, here I'm going to add h3 heading tag with the text savings. Save these changes, and I'm going to back to the export label right here. I'm going to just add here empty bracket, something like this, the parent bracket, and then inside this curly braces I'm going to call label component, and then I'm going to pass here parenthesis. Let me save the changes. As you can see, I'm going to have this label component here. Just after that, just after this saving, I want the percentage. So after this div right here, I'm going to add another h3 heading tag with the text 45%. So I'm going to have here 45%. You can notice. After that, let me specify some classes to it. I'm going to specify class name text md, and to this h3 heading tag, I'm going to specify font bold. Just after that, at the top, before this h3 heading tag right here, I'm going to add a division tag with some classes. So I'm going to add here width 2, height 2, rounded, padding by 3, and then I'm going to specify here style, and inside this style I'm going to specify background color to this division tag. So I'm going to say here background. So I'm going to just back to the app.css. Let me copy this background color, this hex value, and then I'm going to specify that something like this. And now, because I'm using style inside the JSX component, we need to wrap this inside the curly braces. Let me save the changes. I'm going to have here a little label. Now, just for that, let me create two more labels here. So I'm going to iterate over this label using object. So at the top, right up here, I'm going to create a simple constant object is equal to array of object, and inside this I'm going to pass value to this label. So first I'm going to specify color, which is this default value. So let me copy this. At the top here I'm going to say color, then I'm going to add here type, which is going to be savings, and then I'm going to specify percent. So I'm going to say here 45, something like this. Let me save this. Now just for that, let me copy this, pass here comma, and create two more objects. Here I'm going to specify investment, and this became expense. Let me change this value. So if I specify here 20 and 10, then I can iterate over this object and create different components. So what I'm going to do is, instead of this label component right here, I'm going to say obj.map I'm going to iterate over this object. So I'm going to call here map with two parameters, value and index. And when I call this callback function, inside this, I'm going to call this label component. So here I'm going to call label component, something like this. And to this label component, you need to first specify the unique key. So you have to specify here key, which is the index value of this object. And then I'm going to specify data. So I'm going to pass here data is equal to, and in the curly braces, I'm going to pass this v. So inside this v, inside this value, we have this object. So once I pass this object to this data, I can access this data inside this label. So I'm going to pass here object data with this structure, this data from the properties like this. And here I'm going to say if we don't have data, then just return empty JSX. And if we have that, then just get rid of these hard-coded values and pass the variable data. So you have to say here data dot color. And if we don't have value inside this color, I'm going to just specify here nullish coalescing operator. So this is going to specify the default value to this background. If we have null or undefined inside this color, I'm going to do the same for the saving as well. So I'm going to say here curly braces, pass here data dot type. If it is null or undefined, I'm going to pass default value empty string. Then I'm going to do the same for this 45% as well. So here I'm going to pass data dot percent. And if we don't have any value inside it, I'm going to pass 0 as a default value. Let me save this. As you can see, you're going to have 3 labels. Now, just for that, if I change this value of this color, if I change this color, for example, if I get this value right from here, and if I pass that to this color section, when I save the changes, you can see I'm going to have this color to this label. Now this data is currently inaccurate. When we get the data from the backend, then this data will make sense. Next, I'm going to show you how you can make form inside this application. Now, once you understand how you can add chart and labels inside your expense tracker, let me show you how you can make the second column. So inside the first column, I'm going to put the chart and these labels. If you open the app.js, you can notice here, in the first column, I'm going to put this graph component. In the second column, I'm going to add forms. So let's create a new component inside this component folder. I'm going to create a new file with form.js name, and then I'm going to here add React functional component. Save this file back to the app.js. At the top here, I'm going to say import form from component form, and then I'm going to copy this form and pass that here, something like this. So let me just save these changes. You can see right now I'm going to have this form at the bottom. If I increase the size of this expense tracker application, you can see I'm going to have this form at the right side of the screen. Now let me toggle this window to the right side and toggle this VS Code on the left side. On the right side, we have the expense tracker application, and on the left side, we have this VS Code. Now, just for that, I'm going to close this app.js, back to the form, and right here, I'm going to add a simple form. So I'm going to just add here a div with the class form, and to this form, let me specify some Tailwind classes, which is max width SM and mx auto. And then I'm going to specify width is going to be 96. After that, inside this form, I'm going to add h1 heading tag with the text transaction. And then to this h1, I'm going to specify class font bold, padding bottom 4, and text Excel, something like this. After this h1, here I'm going to add my form. Let me get rid of this action attribute because we are not using it. Then I'm going to specify ID, which is form, and then inside this form right here, I'm going to add different input text boxes. So let me add here first a division tag with grade class. inside this grid, I have only one column. So I'm not going to add any column class here. So just out of that, I'm going to say gap 4. So this will add a gap between all the input text boxes. So inside this, here I'm going to add input group. Oops, I think I misspelled this group spelled. Input group. And inside this input group, I'm going to add input text box with the placeholder salary, house rent, or SIP. So you can add any text inside this input text box. And just out of that, let me add here class call form input. Let me save the changes. You can see I'm going to have here the input text box. Just out of that, right down here, I'm going to add the select HTML element. Let me get rid of this name and this ID. And to this select, I'm going to specify class, which is form input. And then I'm going to specify here different options. So I'm going to add here option, which is investment. And then I'm going to add here attribute default value. And for the text, I'm going to specify investment. Let me duplicate these 2 more times and get rid of this default value right from here. And instead of investment, right now I'm going to say expense. And this became saving. If you want, instead of savings, you can add cash as well. That's upon you. So let me copy this, change this value as well, like this. Save these changes. You can see we have the select input here. Just out of that, I'm going to copy this division tag again of input group and paste that after this select. And then let me get rid of this placeholder. Instead of this salary, rent, and SIP, right now I'm going to pass here amount. I'm going to leave everything as it is. Let me save this. So I'm going to have here input text box. After that, here I'm going to add a button to submit this data. But let me wrap this button inside the division tag. So I'm going to add here dot submit btn. And inside this div, I'm going to wrap this button something like this. Let me specify some classes to it. So I'm going to specify some Tailwind classes. Is going to be border, padding white 2, text is going to be white. Then I'm going to specify bg, indigo 500. So this will specify background color, and width is going to be full. And after that, I'm going to specify text here, make transaction. Save this. You can see I'm going to have my button here. Now just out of that, let me specify styling to this input text boxes. Now as you can see, I'm using a class to all the input text boxes, which is form input. So I'm going to back to the app.css and right down here, let me just first select the form input, the custom class, and then I'm going to add here different Tailwind CSS classes. So to add Tailwind CSS classes inside CSS, you have to add here apply directives. So you have to say here apply, and then I'm going to add margin top 1, then specify here block, then I'm going to specify width full to all these input text boxes. Then I'm going to specify here padding white 2. So this will add top and bottom padding. Then I'm going to add padding x3. So this will add left and right padding. Then let's specify border. Then I'm going to specify border color. So I'm going to say here border gray 200. Then I'm going to specify background color, which is beige white. And then I'm going to specify rounded MD. So this will just specify border radius to all the input text boxes. And then I'm going to say focus, and I'm going to remove the outline from this input text box. So I'm going to say here focus, outline, none. And after that, I'm going to say focus, ring, indigo 500. So when we focus on these text boxes, I want to specify this ring indigo class. And at the end, I'm going to specify SM, text SM. Let me save all the changes. Oops, I think I misspelled something. Yeah, right here. It's outline. That's it. Now, as you can see, when I save the changes, you can see the form is now completely ready. Now, just out of that, what I want to add functionality to this form. So when the user click on this make transaction, I want to get the data from this input text boxes and display that in the console. So just for now, I'm going to print all the data in the console. And when we add the backend, I'm going to get that data and pass that to the post request. So just for now, let's get this data and display in the console. Let me close this app.css. Let me save this file, close this label and this graph. Now to get the data from this input text boxes, I'm using a library, React Hook Form. Using that library, we are easily going to get all the data of these input text boxes. We can also easily validate all the data of these input text boxes. If you don't know about this React Hook Form library, then I have a dedicated video on it. You can check out that video from the top right corner of the screen or from the description. So let me just open my terminal, and here we need to say npm I for install and then install React Hook Form. I'm going to install this library in the React application. Once I have this library, let me close the terminal. At the top, I'm going to say import use form. I'm using a hook of that library, which is use form from React Hook Form. Using only this single hook, you can get all the data of your form. Let me show you how. Inside your form, you have to call here use form hook and then destructure different properties. So I'm going to say constant in the object. So from this use form, you will get the register function, the handle submit function, and the reset field function. Using this register, you can register your input text boxes. Using this handle submit, you're going to submit the data to the form, and using this reset field, you're going to reset the value of your input text boxes. So let me just first use this handle submit. So to this form, I'm going to simply add on submit event. On submit, I'm going to call this handle submit function. So let me copy this and paste that here. So when we click on the button of this form, I'm going to call this handle submit handler function. And inside this parenthesis, we need to call a function. And inside that function, we can get the value of these input text boxes. So here I'm going to say constant on submit is equal to pass here data, and in this curly braces I'm going to say console.log data like this, and then I'm going to pass this on submit to this handle submit, something like this. That's it. Now when you click on the form, it will execute this handle submit handler function, and then that will pass data to this on submit. And you can access that data using this data parameter. You can name this parameter anything. That's upon you. Now, just for that, you need to register all your input text boxes. You need to tell this handler submit function from where he need to get the data. So I'm going to use this register function to get the data. So we are using this register function to register this input text boxes. So to this input text box, we need to specify here curly braces, pass here register, and then specify the name for your input text box. I'm going to specify text here name. That's upon you. You can specify any name to your input text box. I'm going to name this input as name. So when you get the data inside this data variable, you're going to have property called name, and to that property, you're going to have the value of this input text box. Now, just for that, make sure you pass here spread operator. So this is a simple syntax to get the value of your input text box using this React Hook Form library. So let me just copy this. Just for that, I'm going to pass this to this select, and instead of name, I'm going to pass here type. Then to this placeholder amount, I'm going to pass amount. Let me save these changes, open the console, and now if I pass some data, for example, if I pass here salary, investment, and amount is going to be $500. When I click on the make transaction, as you can see, I'm going to have a data in my console. So I'm going to have name, salary, type is going to be investment, and amount is going to be 500. So when you click on this add transaction, you're going to get this form data inside this data variable. And now you can pass this data variable to the post request. So you can post this data in your database. Now, just for that, let me show you how you can display transaction in this application. So just down here, we are going to add a component called list and display all the transaction of this application. So let's see how you can create this. Now, just out of that, once you understand how you can get the data from this form, inside the console, let me show you how you can display transaction of your database just under this form. So I'm going to create a new component for that, and I'm going to name that component list.js. So here I'm going to add React functional component, save this file back to the form. I'm going to just import that component. So I'm going to say here import list from list. I'm going to separate this component from the form. So I'm going to just import this list inside this form, and then I'm going to copy this, and after this form right down here I'm going to paste that list. Let me save this. So you can see I'm going to have here list, back to the list.js, close this form. So to create a list component, you have to first create a division tag with the flex class. So you can easily add different items inside it. I'm going to say flex, then I'm going to specify flex column. I'm going to put everything in the column vertically, and then I'm going to pass padding by 6. That will add top and bottom padding, and gap is going to be 3. Just out of that, here I'm going to add h1 heading tag with the text history. And then I'm going to pass here some classes of Tailwind, which is padding by 4. Then I'm going to add text MD. Then font is going to be bold and text Excel. I'm going to increase the text, so let me get rid of this text MD. Out of this h1, I'm going to add all the transaction. So instead of adding here JSX elements, let me create a new component for that. So I can iterate over an object and print all the transaction. So just down here, let me create a function called transactions. I'm going to create transaction and then pass here an object. And then I'm going to destructure category. You can specify any name to this variable. That's upon you. You're passing value to this transaction from this list component. Inside this, here I'm going to say if we don't have category, then I'm going to return null. Otherwise, I'm going to return JSX. So inside this, I'm going to create div with item class, something like this. And then I'm going to specify here flex, justify center, and bg gray 50. Then I'm going to specify padding by 2. So this will add top and bottom padding, and then rounded R. So that here I'm going to add a span tag with name savings, and to this span let me specify classes block and with full, and then I'm going to call this transaction right here, something like this. When I save the changes, I'm not going to get anything. This is because I don't have this category parameter to this function. Instead of function, if I pass here transaction, something like this, then I can simply pass here category, and here I'm going to specify an object. Inside this curly braces, I'm going to specify an object, and I'm going to iterate over that object and print a different transaction. For example, if I create here an object at the top, let me just copy this label object right from here, paste that in the list, and if I get rid of this percent like this, and if I get rid of this type and specify here name, something like this, let me save these changes, copy this object. Instead of this transaction, here I'm going to pass curly braces, pass the object dot map, and iterate over this object with value and index, and then I'm going to return this transaction. And to this category, I'm going to pass value v to this category, and to this key I'm going to specify I for index. Let me save this. You can see I'm going to have here 3 objects, and then instead of these hard-coded values, I can just simply pass here category dot name. If we don't have value here, then I'm going to pass empty string. And right here to this division tag, I'm going to pass border right. So I'm going to pass here style. In the curly braces, I'm going to say border right. In the template string, I'm going to say 8 pixel solid. And then I'm going to add category dot color. This variable, this one, I'm going to pass that here. And if we don't have value here, I'm going to pass the default value, something like this. Let me save the changes. You can see I'm going to have here a simple border. After that, I also want to add here a button inside this transaction, so we can delete the transaction. For that, I'm using here a button with the class padding x3, and then I'm going to specify here icon. Now, because we don't have any icons, let me install a library. I'm going to open my terminal. Here, I'm going to install a library called npm install box icons. I'm going to install this library in the React project. So once we have this library, we can use it. So at the top here, I can simply say import box icons. And to use icons inside the React application, you can just get rid of this hard-coded value. And here you can call box, and using name property, you can pass the icon type. So I'm going to say here trash. Save this. You can see trash icon. When I click on this icon, I want to delete this transaction. Just out of that, let me specify size for this icon. Size is going to be 15 pixel like this. And then I'm going to specify color as well. So specify color. In the curly braces, I'm going to pass color. Now, because we already have here this color, let me copy this and specify that here. So if we have color property, then specify that to the color or pass the default value. Let me save this. You can see this will specify color to this icon. Now you can see how easy it is to add transaction history inside your application. So now you can notice we successfully created the front end of this application. Next, I'm going to show you how you can add backend to this application using Express and MongoDB. So let's see how to do it. As you know, we successfully created the front end for this application. Let me just show you how you can make backend and pass data to the front end. So as you know, in the client folder, we have the React application where we have the front end. Inside this server, let's create the backend for this application. So for the backend, I'm using MongoDB and Express HTTP server. So let's first create the HTTP server. So I'm going to open a terminal, and here I'm going to first enter into the project, which is Express Tracker, and then I'm going to enter into server. And inside this server, I'm going to install few libraries. But before that, let me initialize this server as npm package, or you can say node project. So I'm going to say npm init -y. So this is going to initialize this project as node project. Now once you have the package.json file, let me clear the screen, and then I'm going to install few libraries here. So I'm going to say here npm I for install, and then I'm going to install Express. Using Express node framework, we create the HTTP server. Then I'm going to install course. This JavaScript library allows us to share the data between two different origins. Just out of that, we install .env. So the .env module allows us to store the secret credential of the document. Then we install Mongoose, allows us to work with MongoDB Database. And then I'm going to install NodeMon. NodeMon allows us to restart the server whenever we make changes in it. So every time you make changes in the server file and save it, NodeMon will automatically restart the server. You don't have to do anything manually. So let's install all this library and press enter. Now once you install all these libraries, just clear the screen, close the terminal, open the server folder, and inside this, create a new server.js file. Using this file, we create the HTTP server. So let's first require the Express application. So we need to say here constant express is equal to require, we pass express. If you don't know about Express framework, I have a complete course on it. You can check out that course from the top right corner or from the description. So once we have the Express, let's create an instance of Express application. You have to say here app, the constant app is equal to Express and pass parentheses. So this statement is going to initialize this app as Express application. So we are just going to create an instance of the Express application. Just for that, I'm going to say constant course is equal to require, in the single quote, we pass course. After that, I'm going to say constant port is equal to, and then I'm going to specify port to my server, which is 5000. Just after that, right down here, we need to use middlewares. So to use middlewares in Express, you have to say app dot use, and inside this you can specify your middlewares. So let's first use course. Just for that, we need to share data as a JSON format. So we need to have here a statement called app.use, and inside this we need to say express.json. If you are using the latest version of Express, you don't have to use body parser. Instead, you can just use express.json. Just for that, let's listen this application on port 5000. Here I'm going to say app.listen. Listen this application on this port, means on 5000 port, and then I'm going to specify here a callback function. Inside this callback, I'm going to say console.log print a message which is server is running on port, and then I'm going to pass here $ curly braces and then specify the port name. So this will just print this message when the app is successfully running. Now let me save these changes and let's start this server. To start the server, we need to back to the package.json. Let me get rid of this test, and here I'm going to say start, and here we need to say nodemon server.js. We need to execute this server file. Let me save this, open the console. Here we need to say npm start. So this will start the server. You can see we have here a message, server is running on port 5000. So we successfully started the Express server. Now just for that, let's create different routes inside this application. So instead of creating all the routes right here inside the server.js, let's make a dedicated file for that, so we can manage all the routes very easily. So inside this server right here, I'm going to create a new folder, and inside that folder I'm going to say routes, and inside this routes folder, let's create a new file with the name route.js. Now just for that, once you have routes, let's grab the React Express application instance and call a router function. So I'm going to say here constant routes is equal to require, and what we have to require is we have to require Express framework dot router, something like this. So this variable now allows us to create different routes inside this route file. Now once we've done that, let's create the first route. So I'm going to say here route dot route, and inside this I'm going to pass single quote and then pass /API, then pass / again, and then specify the route endpoint, which is category. So whenever we make request to the server, we need to pass API and the endpoint. So right now we are creating the endpoint categories. Let's make a get request. So I'm going to say here get. Now this get method is now chained with this route. You can write this get right down here as well. So just down here, I'm going to say get, and inside this we need to pass the controller, or you can say the handler function. So I'm going to just pass here a function, and to this function we need to pass two parameters, request and response. And inside this function, let me say response.json, and I'm going to say get request from categories. That's it. This is a very simple route, right? Now, just for that, we need to export this route so we can use it in the server file. So I'm going to say here module dot exports is equal to routes. That's it. Now, if you make a request on these categories, you will get this JSON response. Let me show you. Let me save these changes first. Back to the server. And inside this server, we need to first use these routes. So let's add here a comment and say using routes. And then I'm going to say app.use. And let's use this route. So let's require here a file from routes folder. So we need to say here ./routes and the route.js file. So now you successfully added a new route to this server. Now let me just show you how you can test this route. You have to make a GET request to these categories. To make this GET request, I'm using Postman API testing tool. I already have this Postman API testing tool in my local system. I'm going to search for Postman API testing tool in my system. If you don't know how to use this Postman, then don't worry about that. It's super easy to use. You have to just install this Postman in your local system and just open the collections. Inside collection, create a new collection and specify name to it. I already have here a collection expense server. Inside that, I have different requests. To create this request, you have to click on this 3 dots and specify a new request using add request option. When you click on the add request, it will allow you to specify the name for your request and the path. You can see this is a name for this request and this is the path for this request. Now what we have to do is we have to make a GET request to these categories. So we need to just copy this path and pass that here. And as you know, we are not on localhost 8080. We are on localhost 5000. So now when I click on this send button, you can easily get the JSON response, which is GET request from categories. So we successfully make the GET request from the server. Now once you create your first GET request, now what if you have 100 line of code inside this callback function? In that case, you have to separate that function from this route. So what we are going to do is we create a controller for this request. So instead of creating this function inside this GET request, let's create a new folder here with the name controller, which controls the request. So inside this controller, let's create a new file controller.js. And inside this controller, we create. So next, I'm going to show you how you can add controller in the server. Now, let's take a look at how we can make controllers in the server. As you know, we created here a callback function inside this GET request. Instead of creating this function here, we create a controller for that. So inside this controller.js file, here we create a controller to get the categories. So I'm going to first say here function, then specify the name for this function. I'm going to say create categories. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this function. And then we need to pass 2 parameters here. As you can see, we have here 2 parameters, request and response. So we need to pass here 2 parameters, request and response, something like this, and pass curly braces. Inside this controller, I'm going to simply copy this statement and paste that here. Just for that, you need to export this function so you can use that in this route. So you have to say here module.exports is equal to, and in the object, I'm going to say create categories. Now because I'm creating multiple controllers inside this controller file, I put here an object, and inside that I'm going to return this create categories function. So using the single object, I can access all the controllers. So let me save this file back to the route.js, and at the top here we need to call controllers. So we need to say here constant controller is equal to require, and require a file called controllers. So as you know, the controller file is outside of these routes. So you have to say here /controller and the controller.js file. And after that, instead of this callback function, you can just simply call here controller.create categories. That's it. Let me save the changes, open the Postman API testing tool, and let's click on this send button. When you click on it, you can see you're going to get the same result. So we successfully created the controller for this application. Now, just for that, let me show you how you can create .env file where you can store all the secret data of your server. For example, your port number or your API key and so on. So let's create a new file inside this server and name that file config.env. Now, as you know, we already installed .env module in this project, so we don't have to worry about anything. Just for that, inside this .env file, I'm going to create a variable. So I'm going to say here port is equal to 8080. I'm specifying 8080 port name to my server if I'm getting the value from the .env file. Otherwise, I'm going to use this 5000 port number. So let's first save this file back to the server. And instead of this 5000, you have to first get this configuration file right here. You have to say require, specify .env, the module name, .config, and you have to configure the path of this file. So just specify here an object, and here specify path, colon, and in the double quote, I'm going to say .config.env. So this will configure this file. Once you configure this file, you can easily specify here process.env.port or use this 5000 port name. So now I'm using this port variable using this process object. Using this process object, we can access the env variables. So I'm just going to say process.env.port. So we are accessing this port variable inside this server. So now let me just open my terminal, save this file, and now you can see my server is now running on port 8080. So now whenever you deploy this application, you can just easily change your port name using this configuration file. That's super easy, right? Now just after that, you have to make sure you change this number as well. So now the server is running on 8080. Or you can just simply copy this link, open your server, and here you can specify HTTP localhost and then specify your port name, something like this. So now in the console, you will get your server address. As you can see, you have your server address here. Just after that, once you have your .env, let's add MongoDB and store data inside it. Now, once you understand how you can create Express server, how you can create different routes, and how you can add controller to your different routes, and how you can create and add .env file inside your Express server, let me show you how you can connect MongoDB to this Express application. I'm going to open a new tab, and here I'm going to say MongoDB Atlas. So I'm going to just create my document, or you can say my database in the cloud. So I'm using MongoDB Atlas for that. So let me first sign up with MongoDB Atlas. So what you have to do is you just have to sign up with your Google account. Just click on the sign up with Google and sign in with your Google account. Once you've done that, you will have the window something like this. I already have one project here. So let's create another project. So let me just click on this new project, and I'm going to name this project Expense Tracker. And then I'm going to click on this next button. And then you can add a member or set a permission using this option. I'm going to leave everything as it is and just click on this create project. So this is going to create a new project inside the MongoDB Atlas. We successfully have the expense tracker project. Now let's create and build a database. So let's click on this build a database button. When you click on it, you will have different options. You have the serverless option, the dedicated server, or the shared server. The shared server is free of cost. So just choose that. Click on the create button. When you click on that button, you will have three options. Just leave everything as it is. I'm going to leave everything as it is. And then I'm going to click on this cluster name. And then I'm going to choose my cluster name, which is expense details. If you want, you can leave everything as it is. That's upon you. And then I'm going to click on this create cluster. So once you click on create cluster, you have to specify the username and password for your database. So let me just specify here a demo username and password. So just for this example, I'm choosing a very simple username and password. I'm going to say here admin, and the password is going to be admin123. So now whenever you want to access your database, you need your username and password. Just so that you can specify your local environment or the cloud environment. Now you can wait for 3 to 5 minutes, or you can just click on this database. Now you can see a message here, your cluster is being created, and then you have to click on this database access. You have here a username and password of your database, and then click on network access. Here you have to add your IP address. Just click on this add IP address. You just have to click on this add current IP address. I don't want to show my IP address, so I'm just going to click on this allow access from anywhere. Just for that, I'm going to click on this database again. The expense detail cluster is now successfully created. Now what you have to do is you have to connect this cluster with your Express server. If you back to the network access, you have this active status. So the IP address is successfully linked with your database. Then you can click on this database access. You have your username and password, and then click on this database. When you click on it, you have 3 buttons here: connect, view monitoring, and browse collections. Right now we don't have any collections inside this database. So let's connect this database with your HTTP server. So let's click on this connect. When you click on it, you have here 3 options: connect with MongoDB shell, connect your application, and connect using MongoDB Compass. Click on this second option, which is connect your application. Copy this URI, replace the password field with your password of your admin user, and then you can replace the database name as well. So let me first copy this URI, close the window, back to the application. Now instead of creating this connection inside this server file, let's separate the connection file. So inside this server, here I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to specify name to it, db. And inside this, I'm going to create a file called connection.js. And inside this file, you have to create a connection between your HTTP server and the MongoDB database. So now you have to first back to the config.env file, and here let's create a new variable, which is Atlas URI is equal to, and then paste here the copy link, the MongoDB URI. And as the MongoDB document says, replace this password with your own password of your username. So I'm going to say here admin 123. Just out of that, I'm going to change the database name as well. So my first database is your database name. We're going to replace that with Express database. And you have to leave everything as it is. Close this config file, open the connection.js, and here you have to say constant mongos is equal to require, and require the mongos module. And using this mongos, you can connect with your cluster. So you have to say here constant connection is equal to mongos.connect, and then you have to specify the URI of your MongoDB cluster. So let me just pass here this variable Atlas URI. So I'm going to just back to the connection. Here I'm going to say process.env.atlas URI. I'm going to use this variable right here. Once you've done that, this function is going to return a promise. So you can get that promise, or you can just say here then db and specify here console.log, and you can say here database connected. You can display a message to the user that the database is connected, and you can return a database. Or you can just call here a catch method to catch the error. So you can just simply say here console.log and print here connection error. And you can also print this variable. That's upon you. Now, just for that, you have to export this connection variable so you can use this connection in your server file. So you have to say module.exports is equal to connection. That's it. That's so easy, right? To create a connection between your HTTP server and the MongoDB Atlas. Let me save this file, back to the server, close this connection file, and right here, I'm going to add a comment and say MongoDB connection. And then I'm going to say here constant connection is equal to, and then here require a file called connection. So as you know, we have this file in the DB folder. So specify dot / and the connection file. You can also specify here the extension. That's upon you. Now what I only want to execute, or you can say listen this server when I have the valid connection. So just down here, I'm going to say connection dot then if we have database, a valid database connection. So I'm going to say if we don't have database, then return process dot exit. So I'm going to just exit from this application if we don't have database. And if we have database, then I'm going to start this server. So I'm going to just copy this code and paste that right here. And I'm going to just call here a command, listen to the HTTP server only when we have the valid connection to the MongoDB cluster database. Now just out of that, if there is an error inside this app, you can call here app.on method, and inside this you can catch your error of your HTTP server. So you can just call here error, pass your parameter error, and then say console.log, and in the double quote you can specify failed to connect with HTTP server. And then if you want, you can wrap this parameter with this error message using template string, something like this. Now just out of that, if there is an error inside MongoDB database, I'm going to just catch that error as well. So here I'm going to first add a comment and say if there is an error in MongoDB connection. If there is an error inside MongoDB connection, I'm going to catch that error inside this callback function, and then I'm going to say console.log, and using a template string I'm going to say connection failed, or you can say display this error. That's it. Now let me just save all the changes, open the terminal, and now when I save the changes, you can see I'm going to have here a message, database connected. So we successfully connected with the MongoDB database. Now next I'm going to show you how you can create different collections, and then I'm going to show you how you can create controllers. Now once you have the successful connection with your MongoDB database, let's create MongoDB scheme, or you can say MongoDB modules. The modules is nothing but a simple structure of your MongoDB collection. So let's create a new folder here inside this server. I'm going to separate all the folders to make this application more easier to maintain. So let's create a new folder here for modules. So I'm going to say here modules, and inside this I'm going to create a new file, model.js, and inside this I'm going to create, or you can say specify structure to my MongoDB documents. So let's create here a first constant variable, and then specify here schema is equal to require mongoose dot schema, or you can just create a constant variable for mongoose separately, something like this, and then you can just simply say here mongoose dot schema. Now because we are using the mongoose variable as well inside this module, so I'm going to just separate mongoose and this schema in the dedicated variable. Now just out of that, once you require the mongoose and the schema, you have to specify structure for your documents. So I'm going to create two documents inside this project. First for the categories, and second for the transactions. Inside the categories, we create two fields. First we're going to create type of category, and second we create color. We specify the color for this category using this color field. Just after that, inside this transactions, we first create the name for the transaction, then specify type field to this transaction. So we can link category and transaction together using this type property, or you can say using this type field. You can call this type field as a foreign key. Just for that, we create amount, and then we create date field. Date field is optional. Let's create category first. So say here constant categories model is equal to create a new schema. And inside the schema, you have to specify structure for your document. So in the object, you specify structure. So first, as I said, we create a type field, and this type field is a type of string. So I'm going to pass here :string, and then we specify here default value to this field, which is investment. After that, I'm going to pass here comma and create the second field, which is color. To this color, I'm going to specify type, which is string, and default value is going to be the default color. So just for now, I'm going to specify this hex value right here. So this is my first category model, or you can say my first category document. Now just for that, let's create this transaction model. So I'm going to say constant transaction model is equal to new schema, and inside this we create an object. Here we first specify name field. So I'm going to say name, and in the object I'm going to specify type of this field, which is going to be string. Then I'm going to specify default value. Default value is going to be anonymous. Just out of that, I'm going to copy this statement, paste it down here, and I'm going to create the next field, which is type, and I'm going to specify type of it, which is string, and the default value is going to be investment. Then I'm going to copy and paste the field again, and then I'm going to get rid of this name and specify here amount. And this is not a type of string, this is a type of number, and I'm going to get rid of this default value right from here. I'm not going to pass any default value to this amount. Just out of that, as I said, you can add this date field to this transaction, or you can remove this field from this model. I'm going to add that. So I'm going to say here date. It is a type of date, and the default value is going to be the date dot now. So the current date is the default value of this date field. That's it. So now once we create both these models, let's add these models to the MongoDB database. So you have to say here mongos dot model, and inside this you have to first specify name to your model. I'm going to specify categories. This is the name for this model, and then specify structure. You can see we have this structure of this document. So let me copy this, pass that here. So we first specify name to this document and specify the structure. Let's do the same for this transaction model. So I'm going to say mongos dot model, specify name to this document. I'm going to specify transaction, and then specify here transaction model. Now just like that, you have to export these values. So at the top, I'm going to say constant categories is equal to, then here I'm going to say constant transaction is equal to, and then I'm going to store both these models inside these variables, and then I'm going to say here exports dot default is equal to transaction. So transaction is the default export from this model, and then I'm going to say module dot exports is equal to, and pass here an object, and then I'm going to specify here categories and transaction. So I'm going to first specify the default export, and then I'm going to export both these models using this object. And now this is going to create both these models inside your MongoDB database. That's it. Now you successfully created two different documents inside the MongoDB database. Next, I'm going to show you how you can insert data inside this document using controllers. Now, once we understand how we can specify structure to the document, let's take a look at how you can store data inside it. As you can see, inside this model, we created categories and the transaction model. Let's store data inside these categories first. So let's close this model and open the controller.js file. From here, we're going to store data inside the categories. So you can see here we have a controller called create categories. I'm going to make post request on these create categories and store data inside the category model. So let's get rid of this response right from here. And I'm going to grab the structure of my document using model.js file. I'm going to just require a model. So here I'm going to say constant model is equal to require single quote, I'm going to say double dot / then specify model and model.js. So inside this model, I'm going to have the structure of the document. Now using this model variable, I can store data inside my categories. So let me just create a constant variable here. Create is equal to, and then create a new instance of a model dot categories. As you know, inside this model constant variable, we have categories. So let's call the categories and pass parentheses to it. Inside this parentheses, you need to specify your field values. So in the object, I'm going to specify values to the field. So we have type field inside these categories. I'm going to specify value to it, which is saving. And then we have color field. And then here I'm going to specify the hex value to this color field. You can notice how I specify values to this categories model. I specify type, saving, and color is going to be the dark color. Now for these categories, I'm not getting the values from the user. Instead, I pass values using this controller. Now, once we have a new instance of this model, I can store this data in the MongoDB database. So what we have to do is, right down here, we have to say create this variable dot save, and we have to save this data. So we call here a function save, and this function returns nothing. So inside this, we call a function with error parameter. If we have error, so I'm going to say here if we don't have error, then I'm going to return response.json with create variable. So I'm going to pass this create as a response from this function. And if we have error inside this function, inside this save, I'm going to return response.status with 400 error status code. And then I'm going to say JSON. In the object, I'm going to specify message, which is going to be error while creating categories. And then I'm going to concatenate, or you can say link, this error variable, this one. Now we successfully created a post controller. What you have to do is you have to make a post request on HTTP localhost 8080 API and categories. You have to make a post request to this URL to create a new category. Let me first save these changes back to the route, and you can notice here we have here a get request. Instead of get, we specify here post, because we are posting data to the categories. We make a post request. Let me save this file. Open the terminal. You can see we successfully connected with the database. Let me save all the changes. Open my browser, and now I'm going to click on this browse collections. Here you can see we have a database name, expense database, and then we have two documents here, categories and transaction. Inside these documents, we don't have anything. Now when I make a post request to these categories, this controller is going to store this data inside the categories document. Let me show you. If I open my Postman testing tool, and if I just click on this create post, and if I make a post request on HTTP localhost 8080 on API categories, when I click on the send button, this is going to store this data inside the categories field. So when I click on the send, you can see I'm going to get the response from the MongoDB database. So this is going to store both these fields inside MongoDB database. And then for this document, MongoDB is going to specify the unique ID. If you back to the MongoDB database and refresh this, then you can notice inside these categories, you have one document. That's super easy, right? Now let me add another with different data. Instead of saving, I'm going to say expense. And then I'm going to change this hex value as well. So instead of this hex value, I'm going to change this hex, something like this. Save this file, back to the Postman testing tool, and make a request. When I click on send, you can see we get a new document as a response. So now this data is also going to store inside the MongoDB database. If I refresh the collection, you can see I'm going to have 2 documents. Now just for that, let me add one more for investment. So let me get rid of these expenses, and here I'm going to say investment, and I'm going to change the color of this categories. Save this file, back to the Postman testing tool, and click on this send button. This is going to store this data, you can see, and if you click on this refresh, you're going to have 3 objects inside this document. That's super easy, right? To create a new category inside MongoDB collection. Now just out of that, let me show you how you can get this data in your application. So just down here, I'm going to make a GET request on this same address. So let me copy this command, paste it down here, and this time I'm going to make a GET request to the same URI. Now instead of just a function, let me just make this function asynchronous. So I'm going to call here async here and await here. So this will just make this complete function asynchronous. So now we don't have to worry about the execution delay. Right down here, I'm going to say async function get categories with request and response parameter, and then I'm going to just get this category model from this model variable. So I'm going to say let data is equal to await model dot categories, and from the categories, what you want all the documents. So to get that, you have to call here a function find, and inside this parenthesis I'm going to pass an object. So this is going to return all the objects from the category collection. And now once we have that, I can filter that collections. So just for now, if I return response.json with this data, then I can get all the categories as a response from this controller. Let me save this, copy this get categories and pass that here, so I can use this get categories in the route. So back to the route, and here you have to say .get HTTP method, and then specify controller .get categories, something like this. Let me save all the changes. Back to the Postman API testing tool, click on this get categories, and I'm going to make a get request on this URI. You can notice, and when I click on this send, you can see I'm going to get documents as a response. Now if I want, I can filter this data as well. For example, if I only need this type and this color, then I can filter this data and return from this controller as well. Let me show you. If I specify here await data.map, I'm going to iterate over this array of data. So I'm going to say here map, call here v value, and then I'm going to say object.assign. In the parentheses, I'm going to first specify empty object, and to this empty object, I want only 2 properties from this map, type and color. So I'm going to say here type v.type, and color is going to v.color, like this. And then I'm going to store this in a variable. I'm going to name that variable filter. And then I'm going to return this data from this function, something like this. Let me save all the changes. And now when I make a get request, when I click on the send, you can see I'm only going to get type and color as a response. So I'm only going to get the necessary property I want. If you want to get all the properties from this get categories, you can do that as well. That's upon you. Once you understand how you can create and get categories, let me show you how you can create a transaction. So just down here, I'm going to make a async function. I'm going to name that function create transaction, and make sure you pass request and response parameter, something like this, because as you know, this is a controller. Now inside this, instead of passing this hard-coded value, you can see here inside this create categories, we pass this hard-coded value inside this controller. But what I want to get the data from the user and pass that to the post request. So we can store that data in the transaction collection. So at the top, let me first specify here the URI. So let me copy this, paste that here. This is a type of post request, and I'm going to make the endpoint transaction. So when you make a request to the transaction, I'm going to call this controller. And now I'm going to get the data as well from the user. Instead of passing the hard-coded data inside this controller, we get the data from the user. So to get the data, I'm using request.body object. When you make a request, you pass body so you can get the data with the request. So I'm going to say here request.body, and with this body, you're going to get an object. So I'm going to destructure this object using JavaScript destructure feature. So I'm going to say here let, and inside this object, I'm going to destructure all the properties of this body. So I'm going to say here name, type, and amount. As you know, when we create transaction, we need 3 fields: name, type, and amount. We destructure all these fields using this destructure JavaScript feature. Now when we have object inside this body, we destructure it into these variables. And what if we don't have anything inside this body? In that case, I'm going to return an error message. So I'm going to say here if we don't have request.body, then I'm going to return a response.status 400, and then I'm going to pass JSON response, which is post HTTP data not provided, something like this. So this is my custom error, right? Just out of that, right down here, I'm going to create a variable constant create is equal to await new model dot transaction. As you know, we are creating a new transaction, so we call a model transaction, and we need to add a new keyword as well because we are creating a new instance of this transaction model. We call an object like this. Now I have to pass data to all the fields of this transaction model. So as you know, inside this transaction model, we have name, type, amount, and the default field, which is date. Let me pass data to it. So let me pass a value to the name property. So I'm going to say here name, and I'm going to pass this name value to it, which we get from the user. So I'm going to say here name, something like this. In JavaScript, instead of doing this, you can simply pass here name. Both statements are identical. So I'm going to say here name, type, amount, and I'm also going to pass a date property, which is new date. Now if you remove this property from here, that doesn't matter because the default value of this date property is the current date. Now just out of that, just out of this object, right down here, I'm going to say create dot save, and I'm going to save this data using the save function. So I'm going to say here function if there is an error, and here I'm going to say if we don't have any error, then return response.json with this create object, this one. And if there is an error here, I'm going to just return response.status 400.json. And inside this object, I'm going to say message. In the backtick operator, I'm going to say error while creating transaction. So I'm going to pass here the error like this. You can see we successfully created the controller for creating a new transaction. Let me save these changes and make sure you pass this create transaction to this export object like this. So you can pass this to the route. Let me save all the changes back to the route, and here let me create a new endpoint. You can see all the categories can be get with this endpoint categories. Let's create a new endpoint. I'm going to say routes.route, and then I'm going to specify here /API / and then specify here transaction. And then I'm going to specify here dot post. I'm going to make a post HTTP request, and then I'm going to say controller dot create transaction. I'm going to call this controller. create transaction when we make a post request on this transaction endpoint. Let me save the changes and let me test this HTTP request as well. So I'm going to open the create transaction post request. Here you can notice I'm going to make a post request on localhost 8080 API transaction. And make sure you pass data with this request, otherwise you will get an error message. So I'm going to click on this body, and here you can notice I pass here a JSON data. Name, salary, type is going to be investment, and amount is going to be 300. So we pass this data with this post request because we are getting this data from the user. So if I click on the send button, I'm going to get a response from the MongoDB database. You can see MongoDB database return a response. Now just out of that, let me make get request so we can get all the transaction. So I'm going to back to the controller, minimize this create transaction, copy this comment, paste it just down here. Instead of post, this is now a type of get request. So I'm going to say here async function get transaction. And I'm going to pass here request and response parameter like this. And I'm going to say let data is equal to await model dot transaction. And then I'm going to call a method find of Mongo's library. And then I'm going to pass here object. So this is going to return all the data from transaction collection. Now once we have this data, I'm going to return that. So I'm going to say return response.json data. Something like this. I'm not going to filter this data. I'm going to leave everything as it is. Save this file, copy this get transaction, paste that here. So you can use this get transaction in the route. Let me save this, back to the route. Make a get request here. So pass dot get controller dot get transaction. Let me save this file. Back to the Postman API testing tool. Click on this get transaction. I'm going to make a get request on this API transaction. When I click on this send button, you can see I'm going to get the data from the MongoDB database. Now you can see we successfully created the get transaction HTTP request. Now what I want, we also need to create an endpoint to delete this transaction. So when the user click on the delete button, I want to delete the transaction. To do that, let me create a new controller. So I'm going to back to the controller, minimize this. I'm going to copy this command, paste it down here, and this is a type of delete request on the endpoint transaction. Now here I'm going to say async function delete transaction and pass here request and response parameter. Now when making a delete request, you have to get the data from the user. For example, if the user want to delete the previous transaction, user need to pass the ID of that transaction. So you can see here we have the ID parameter with this transaction. You have to pass this ID parameter to this delete controller so we can delete that current object. So I'm simply going to get that object from request.body. So here I'm going to say if I don't have request.body, then I'm going to return a response with the status 400, and then I'm going to say here JSON, and inside this JSON I'm going to return a message which is request body not found. So this is an error message you will get with this delete transaction. Now just out of that, if you have data from the user, for example, if you get ID with this delete request, you can just simply say here await model dot transaction dot delete one. You're going to call a method delete one, and you pass request dot body here, request dot body, and then as a second parameter you call a callback function with error parameter, something like this. And inside this I'm going to say if we don't have error, then I'm going to return response.json record deleted, and at the end make sure you pass here clone catch method to catch the error. So I'm going to say catch, and in the function we pass error and return response .json error while deleting transaction record. Don't forget to pass this delete transaction to this object. Let me save this back to the route, and here you have to call delete HTTP method. So you have to say here delete, and inside this you have to pass controller dot delete transaction. Back to the Postman API testing tool, and here I'm going to click on this delete transaction. You can see here I'm going to make a delete request, and I'm going to make a request to the API transaction endpoint. And in the body, I'm going to pass this raw JSON data. Inside this JSON data, I'm going to pass in the double quote ID and the ID value. So if I back to the transaction, here I'm going to have this ID. You can see I'm going to copy this ID and pass that right here. When I click on this send button, this HTTP request is going to delete this object from this collection. If I click on the send, you can see I'm going to have here a message record deleted. And now if you refresh this collection, the transaction is now deleted from this transaction collection. Now just out of that, at the end, I'm going to just join both these modules together and return a data from the label get endpoint. So what I want to get color from these categories and all the data from this transaction and return as a response. So we have to join both these modules and return as a response. So let me show you how you can join both these modules using Mongo's aggregate function. So I'm going to just back to the controller. Right down here, I'm going to make a get request. So let me copy this, paste that here, and I'm going to make a get request on labels endpoint. So I'm going to say labels, and then I'm going to say here async function get labels, and then make sure you pass request and response parameter like this. I want to look up for the color property of the categories module. So I'm using here Mongo's aggregate function. So right down here, I'm going to say model dot transaction dot aggregate, and I'm going to call here an array. Inside this array, I'm going to pass an object, and inside this object I want to specify the collection I want to join. So here I'm going to first specify a key called lookup. This key allows us to look up for a specific field from the different collection. So I'm going to call here a lookup key. Make sure you pass the same key here inside this object. Inside this key, I'm going to pass a colon and pass an object. Inside this object, I'm going to specify from, and here I'm going to specify the collection we want to join with. I want to join this transaction with categories. So I'm going to specify here categories. Then I pass here comma and pass the second value, which is local field. From the transaction, I want to specify the local field. I'm going to specify here type, and then I'm going to specify the foreign field of these categories. So I'm going to specify here foreign field colon, and in the double quote I'm going to specify type. I have the same value in both these modules. As you know, inside transaction I have type field, and inside the categories I have the type field. So I link both these modules with the same field. Just out of that, once I specify foreign key, I'm going to specify as, and then specify the name of the output array for the result. I'm going to specify here categories info. Now let me explain this statement again. Inside this from, we specify the collection we want to join with. Inside this local field, we specify the field we want to join by the local collection. And then we specify the foreign field, the field we want to join by the foreign collection. And then we pass here as property, the name of the output array for the result. You can specify any value here. That's upon you. Now just out of that, here I'm going to pass comma and pass another object. You can see where I specify the comma. After this object, I'm going to pass an object again and call here unwind. And then pass here colon, and in the double quote pass dollar categories info. I'm going to pass this variable right here. Now this statement deconstruct the array field from the input document to output a document for each element. Now just out of that, I'm going to call here then, and inside the then we pass result parameter. We get the result inside this variable. I'm going to call here result, and then I'm going to say response.json data, and make sure you pass catch as well to catch the errors. I'm going to say here catch error, and I'm going to say here response.status 400 JSON, and then I'm going to pass here lookup collection error. And if you want, you can grab and pass this error with this JSON object. Oops, I think I misspelled here. I need to pass here result instead of data. Something like this. Let me save this back to the get labels and pass that right here. Let me save this file back to the route, and right down here I'm going to make another route. So I'm going to say here routes.route, and in the single quote I'm going to specify /API, then specify / again, and then I'm going to call labels, and then I'm going to make a get request. I'm going to say controller dot get labels, something like this. Let me save this file back to the Postman API testing tool, and let me first create a new transaction using create a transaction. Now let me add a new transaction here. You can see this is my previous data. Let me make a post request on transaction to create a new transaction. You can see in my transaction now I have a one transaction here inside this transaction collection. You can see. Now just out of that, I'm going to just open the aggregate, and here I'm going to make a get request on API labels. I call this controller at endpoint labels. So I'm going to say here API.labels, and I'm going to make a get request on it. When I click on send button, this is going to return a bunch of data. I'm going to get the transaction ID, name, type, amount, and date, as well as inside the same object I'm going to get category info, where I'm going to have the ID of category, type of category, and the category color. Now what I just want to return the important fields from this object. Instead of getting this unwanted data from this get request, I'm going to make a request and get only the necessary properties. So what I want from this object, I want transaction ID, name, type, amount, and this color. I'm using all these values in the front end. That is why I'm going to remove all the unwanted data from it and only going to get ID, name, type, amount, and this color property. So to do that, I'm going to back to the controller. Right here, instead of returning just a result, I'm going to say here let data is equal to result dot map. I'm going to call a map function of JavaScript, and then I'm going to say value. Inside this we have an object, and then I'm going to say object dot assign. I'm going to create a new object using this dot assign method, and then I'm going to pass here empty object and create a new object with underscore ID, and I'm going to pass value to it, which is v.id. As I said, I need only ID from the transaction, so I pass here v.id. Then I need name property of it, so I'm going to say name v.name. Then I want type property, so I'm going to say here type v.type, and I want amount as well, so amount is going to be v.amount. And at the end, as you know, I want color property as well, so I'm going to say here color v.color. Now if you call this property something like this, then you will get an error message. This is because you have this color property inside this category info object. So you have to first call this category info and then call this color property. So instead of this color, I'm going to say category info and then call here array and pass a property name, which is color. Something like this. Pass here colon, and now instead of this result, I'm going to pass here data. Let me save the changes back to the Postman API testing tool, and when I click on this send button, you can see I'm only going to get the necessary data I want. I'm going to get the ID, name, type, amount, and color. That's super easy, right? So now you can see we successfully created all the controllers and all the routes of this expense application. Now, once you understand how you can create this beautiful backend server for your expenses application, let's back to the front end. As you know, we already have the UI for this expense tracker. What we need to do is we need to get the data from this backend and display them right here in this UI. You might know most of the developers use fetch or Axios library to make a request. I also did that in the previous lecture. I use fetch and Axios library to make a request to the server. The problem here is every time you're making the same request. So what we are going to do is instead of making the same request to the server, we are going to store the requested data in the cache memory. So whenever we make the same request again, we get the data from the cache memory and then return as a response. That is going to improve the performance of this application. Let me show you how you can do that using Redux Toolkit. In the previous lecture, we understand how you can use Redux Toolkit in the React application. Let me add that Redux Toolkit in this app to fetch the data from the server. So I'm going to open a new tab and here I'm going to search for Redux Toolkit. And I'm going to click on this first reduxtoolkit.js.org website and I'm going to click on this Get Started. Now to get started with Redux, you have to install a library Redux.js Toolkit. Open the terminal. Here I'm going to first enter into the client. I'm going to say cd client, and once I enter into the React project, here I'm going to say npm I for install, and then I'm going to install Redux Toolkit. Along with that, we also need React Redux library. Using this React Redux library, we get the provider, so we can pass store to it. So let me just install both these libraries. When I press enter, it's going to install both these libraries inside this React project. Now once I've done that, let me start the React project using npm start command. Now just for that, inside this application, let me create a Redux store. In the previous lecture, we understand how you can create Redux store in the React application. Let me create the Redux store here inside this application as well. Now let's create a Redux store. So I'm going to click on this client and create a new folder inside this source. Here I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to name that folder store. Inside this store, I'm going to create a file called store.js, reducer.js, and inside this store, here I'm going to make the Redux store. So to make a Redux store, you have to first import Redux.js Toolkit, and from this module, you have to import configure store. Just add that. Just down here, I'm going to say export constant store is equal to configure store, and in this parenthesis I'm going to pass an object. To this object I'm going to pass reducer, and to this reducer I'm going to pass my reducer function. As you know, right now I don't have any reducer function, so let me just create a reducer inside this reducer.js file. So as you know, to create a reducer in Redux Toolkit, you have to first import the create slice from Redux.js. So I'm going to say here import from Redux Toolkit, and we have to import create slice. Once you import that, just down here you have to say export constant variable expense slice is equal to create slice, and then pass here parenthesis and an object. Inside this object you specify the name for the slice, or you can say you specify names to the store. You initialize the store with the default, or you can say initial value, and then specify your reducer function. So let me first create the initial value to the store. Here I'm going to say constant initial state is equal to, here I'm going to say categories, which is empty array, and transaction is going to be the empty array. And just out of that, right down here, I'm going to specify name to the slice, which is expense. Then I'm going to specify initial state to it, this variable initial state, and then we create a reducers in the object. Now, as you know, to create a reducer, you specify a property. So I'm going to say here get transactions. Then we specify here a callback function. I'm going to say here state, and we pass here callback function, something like this. And this is what we call the reducer. And as you know, using Redux Toolkit, you don't have to create actions. So if you say here export constant, and if you destructure get transaction from expense slice dot action, then this is going to allows us to dispatch action. Now, just out of that, let me export the reducer as well. I'm going to say export default expense slice dot reducer. You all know using reducer, we create a central store. So if you get the data, or you can say using fetch, you make a request to the server and get the data inside this state, then you can access that data anywhere in your React application. But when you do that, you manually have to refresh, or you can say you manually have to update the React component whenever you make a request to the server. So to solve this problem, instead of using reducers, I'm using Redux.js Toolkit query. If you open the Redux documentation, right down here, you have an option RTK Query. Using this Redux Toolkit query, you can easily fetch the data from the server. The Redux Toolkit query is the advanced data fetching and caching tool. This is simply designed to simplify the common case for loading data in the web application. Using this RTK query, we're going to fetch the data from the server, and you don't have to worry about updating the React component. This query will automatically update the React component whenever there is a change in the backend data. So let me show you how you can use this RTK query in your React application. So as you can see, this is my reducer. I'm not going to add anything here. If you want, you can add here the get transaction code, right? That's upon you. Let me save these changes back to the store. At the top here, I'm going to say import. I'm going to import this reducer. So in the store, I'm going to say expense slice from single quote dot / reducer. And then I'm going to pass here expense colon expense slice. Now that's it. Save the changes. After that, you have to wrap this store with the provider. So just back to the index.js. Let me get rid of all these unwanted files right from here. At the top, here I'm going to say import. In the curly braces, I will call provider component from React Redux. So from the React Redux, we call provider component, and we pass that right here, something like this. And now when we wrap the app component with the provider, we need to pass here the Redux store. So at the top, here I'm going to say import store from single quote dot / as you know, we have the store inside the store folder. We pass here store and the store.js file. And then I'm going to pass the store to this provider. So you have to specify here store like this. So now you can access this central store from any component of your React application. That's super easy, right? Let's save the changes back to the application. Oops, I think I misspelled something. If I back to the store, everything is fine here. Go back to the reducer. Yeah, I just misspelled this initial state. It's initial state, something like this. Save this back to the application, and as you can see, we successfully load this application. Now what I want to add this RTK query to this application. So let's see how we can add this and how we can work with this. Now let's take a look at how we can add RTK query inside this application. The RTK query is the advanced data fetching, allows you to fetch the data and cache the data. So let's see how you can use this. You have to import create API and fetch base query from the React Redux Toolkit, and then you have to call the base query and the endpoint inside the create API. Let me explain all these steps one by one. So I'm going to just create a new file, and I'm going to name that file API slice.js. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this file. Inside this file, I'm going to first import two methods, create API and fetch base query. So I'm going to say here import. I'm going to specify curly braces here from, pass here single quote, then I'm going to pass React Toolkit / specify the query, and from the query pass here React. And from this module, I'm going to call create API and fetch base query. I'm using both these functions here. Now, just for that, let me just create the API slice object. So I'm going to say export constant API slice is equal to create API and then pass here an object. Now, the first property we need to specify is the base query. I'm going to say here base query and then call here a function which is fetch base query. Now this function is just a wrapper around the fetch function of JavaScript. This function is just going to make a request to the server. So we pass this function to this base query, and inside this function you pass an object and pass the base URL. As you know, the base URL of your server is this localhost 8080. So I'm going to copy this base URL and I'm going to create here a variable constant base URI is equal to, in the single quote, I'm going to pass this URL. And then I'm going to pass this base URI right here. Now, when we specify this base URI, we need to specify the endpoints. So I'm going to say here endpoints colon, and then you have to specify here a parameter builder, something like this, and then return an object. We use this builder parameter to build a query. So here I'm going to simply first create a property get categories colon, and then call this builder object. And then using this builder object, we can make a query. So we can call here dot query. And in this parenthesis, we pass an object like this, and then we make a request to the server. So you have to pass here a property query, and to this property you need to specify a callback function, something like this, and return the endpoints. As you know, we have the base query, and then using this get categories, I want to get all the categories of the categories document. So I'm going to just call here dot /API /categories. That's it. Now you successfully get all the categories from your server. This is the code you need to fetch the data from your server. That's easy, right? Let me explain this code again. We first call create API function. Inside that, we first initialize this base query. Inside that, we pass the base URI of this application. We're going to make a request to this server, so we pass that URI to this base URL. Just for that, we need to specify endpoints. So we pass here endpoint property and initialize that with this function. This function is going to take a parameter builder, and this builder is going to make a query. So we pass here builder object, and with this builder object, we make a query. This query is going to make a GET request to this API categories. Now keep in mind, the query parameter is going to make a default GET request. You don't have to specify any HTTP method with this query. This is actually going to make a GET request on this URI / your endpoint. So this will just make a GET request on this endpoint, and you will have that data inside this get categories function. Let me show you. Let me save everything and let me export this API slice as default. If I specify export default API slice, something like this, save these changes, close this reducer, back to the store, and here you need to add that API slice. So here you have to first import the API slice from single quote dot /API slice.js. And then just down here, after this expense slice, right down here, you have to specify here array. Inside that, specify API slice dot reducer path, and then pass here colon API slice dot reducer. Just out of that, pass here comma and pass here a middleware default function. So I'm going to say here middleware colon get default middleware, and then I'm going to call this get default middleware dot concat and concat the API slice middleware, something like this. That's easy, right? That's it. You don't have to do anything else. Save this file as well, close this index, save this API slice as well, close this store because now we are not using store anymore. Back to the project, and then I'm going to open the label.js component. Right here, let me show you how you can get the data of these categories in this label. To get that, you're simply going to first import that API slice here. So you have to say import in the curly braces, specify default as API from // specify store, and inside that you have API slice.js. Just pass that file here, and after that, right inside your component, right inside this label, right here, you have to specify API dot use get category query. Now you might ask me, we specify a name for this function which is get categories, and when we call it, it converted into use get categories query. RTK query is going to pass use as a prefix to your query and then add query at the end of your function. And you can notice the first character of every word is capitalized. So every time when you create a function, Redux Toolkit query will convert that function and add use and query at the end of the hook. And now if I grab this and if I print this inside a console using console.log, when I save the changes back to the application, you can notice I'm going to have a bunch of data here inside a console. I'm going to get status pending. The second object is also going to return a status pending, and the last object is going to return status fulfill. If you open this fulfill, you can see inside this data, you have here your categories. When you get the status fulfill, you will get all your data. Otherwise, you will get nothing here inside your data. You can notice. Now what you have to notice is when isFetching is become false, you will get all your data. If you open the previous object, isFetching is true. When this become false, you have all your data. So you can destructure all these properties from this object and get your categories. Let me show you. If I get rid of this console right from here, and if I destructure a constant variable with data, isFetching, isSuccess, and isError. You can notice you're going to have all these properties here. IsError, isFetching, isLoading, isSuccess. You have the status of your request inside these properties, and I'm using that properties inside my React application. So if I say here console.log data, when I save the changes and reload the browser, I'm going to get my data here. Now this is super easy, right? To get the data using RTK query. Next, let me explain all these properties one by one. Now, once you understand how you can get the data using this use get category query, let me show you what is the use of these properties. So instead of data, if I print here isFetching, let me save the changes, and when I execute this browser, you can see 2 times I'm going to get true, and at the end I'm going to get false. This is because this time the status of this isFetching is true, and when we get the data from the server, the isFetching property became false. And the same case for this isSuccess as well. When I save the changes, reload the browser, because we don't have any data, and at the end when we have data, I'm going to get true as a response. So using this property, I can simply return my component only when we have data inside this data variable. Now just out of that, inside this isError, we're going to have the error of this use get categories. Now let me get rid of this console.log and back to the API slice. Now inside this, let me create few more queries. So this is for get categories. Just out of that, right down here, just out of this, get categories. Right down here, I'm going to create another get query for labels. So to make a request to labels, you have to say get labels. This is your function, and you call here builder dot query. You call a query method, and then inside an object you pass query and specify the callback function to it. And in the single quote, you specify the endpoint. So I'm going to copy this, paste it right here, and instead of categories, this time I'm going to say labels. So I'm going to make a get request on labels endpoint. Just out of that, right down here, I'm going to add a new transaction. As you know, to add a new transaction, I have endpoint transaction. So what I'm going to do is, using this API slice, I'm going to make a post request. So right down here, make sure you pass here comma, and right down here, I'm going to add a transaction. So I'm going to call here a function add transaction, call a builder dot mutation. This time, instead of query, we call a function mutation. Whenever we need to create or update or delete the transaction, we use a mutation function. And for getting the data from the database, we use query function. Inside this mutation, we pass an object, and right here we pass query. And to this query, we pass the callback function. You can see I wrap this object inside this parenthesis. This is because I'm going to return this object from this callback function. Now inside this, you have to specify the URL. In the single quote, I'm going to specify /API /transaction. So this is going to be the endpoint of this mutation, or you can say the post request. Then I'm going to pass here comma and specify method. This is going to be the post method, so I'm going to pass here post, and we also need to pass data with the post request. As you know, when we click on this make transaction, we need to pass data as well. So to get that data, so I'm going to pass here parameter body and pass the data which we get from the user. So to get that data, we can just call here initial transaction parameter. You can name this parameter anything, that's upon you, and then you can pass that parameter right here. That's it. Now using this statement, you can add transaction inside your transaction collection. Now just out of that, just after this object right down here, I'm going to add here delete record. So to delete record, as I said, I'm going to say delete transaction colon call the builder dot mutation, and inside this object I'm going to pass a query, the callback function, and then I'm going to say record ID and call here a function, something like this. And inside this function, I'm going to first specify the URL. In the single quote, I'm going to pass API and specify the transaction, the endpoint. Then I'm going to specify the method. As you know, this is a type of delete method. So we pass delete here and we pass body. In the body, I'm going to get the record ID from the user. So I'm going to pass this parameter here. That's it. Now just out of that, let me copy this command for the reference and specify that here. So this is a type of post request on transaction. Let me copy this, pass that here, and this is a type of delete request on transaction. That's it. So back to the label.js, get rid of this object because now we are not using this object. We are getting the value from the database. Now instead of use get categories query, right now I'm going to say use get labels query, and then I'm going to leave everything as it is because from this hook you can get all these properties. Inside this data you have an array of object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass this data to this map right here, and make sure you first check this is fetching and is success. So at the top here I'm going to say let transactions, and right down here I'm going to say if is fetching is true, then execute this if statement. Else if is success, then execute this if statement. Else if is error, then execute this if statement. Here, if it is fetching means if we have true here, that means we don't have any data inside this data variable. So in that case, I'm going to just specify transactions. I'm going to call this variable transactions is equal to, and pass here division tag, fetching. If it is success means if we have data here inside this data variable, this became true, and this will execute this if statement. So here I'm going to say transactions is equal to, and then I'm going to call this data dot map. So I'm going to copy this statement, paste that here, and I'm going to say data dot map, call the value an index variable, and I'm going to leave everything as it is. Save the changes. After that, if there is an error, I'm going to copy this transaction and specify here a division tag with error text like this, and instead of this data dot map, I'm going to call this transaction. That's it. Let me save these changes, back to the application, and as you can see here, I'm going to have label investment because in the database we have only one document label. So that is why as a response we get investment. Now just out of that, let me do the same thing for this list. So what if I open the list.js right up here, if I remove this object, and in this list, if I first get this API, I'm going to copy this import statement, paste it down here, and I'm going to back to the labels, copy this query, this get labels query, paste that down here, and I'm going to copy all this code, and I'm going to paste that right here, something like this. Just out of that, let me get rid of this statement and pass here transaction, and instead of label component, I'm going to copy this transaction and pass that here. Let me save this file, open my browser, reload it. You're not going to get anything here. This is because, as you can see right here, I pass data and we are getting the categories. So let me copy these categories, pass that here, and now you can see I'm going to have here salary. I'm also going to get the color of this salary, means I'm going to get the label as well. Now just for that, let me show you how you can make a transaction using this make transaction button. So if you back to the form, then you can notice inside this data variable, we have all the data of this input text boxes. When we click on the submit button, we get all the data inside this data variable. Inside this API slice, I'm using here mutation to add the data and make a post request to this transaction. So at the top, right up here, I'm going to say import. In the object, I'm going to say default as API from single quote double dot / store API slice .js, and then just after this use form right down here, I'm going to say constant. In the array, I'm going to call add transactions is equal to API dot use add transaction mutation. You can see the name of this function. RTK query is going to pass use as a prefix to the function, and at the end you get mutation because this is a type of mutation. And from that we are destructuring this add transaction function, and you can call this add transaction function inside this on submit to submit the data. So here if I call async to make this function synchronous, and instead of console.log, here I'm going to say if we don't have data inside this variable, then just return empty object. Or if we have data, then I'm going to say await add transaction. I'm going to call this function of this hook And inside that, I'm going to pass my data. And we also need to unwrap this function. To provide a raw response, we use here unwrap function. Just sort of that. Back to my browser, and if I specify here house rent of the type expenses to $50, when I click on the make transaction, you will not going to get anything. But if you back to your collection, when you refresh it, you can see you're going to have two objects here. So now what you have to do is you have to remove, or you can say reset, these text boxes as well as update this history when you click on this make transaction. So whenever you add any data in the transaction, you have to update this UI as well. So I'm going to just first back to the form, and right down here I'm going to use reset field, this use form function, to reset these text boxes. So I'm going to call here reset fields. I'm going to first reset the name, and reset field, reset the amount, and I'm going to leave these options as it is. Just out of that, what I want, when I click on this make transaction, I want to update the data of this history. So what you have to do is you have to back to the API slice, and here you have to add, or you can say provide tags to these labels. To these categories, I'm going to pass comma, and here I'm going to provide tags. Using these tags, you're actually going to group the data together. So any data changes, this API slice is going to fetch the query and update your UI. So here I'm going to specify categories, copy this, pass that to this labels, and instead of categories, here I'm going to pass transactions. Just out of that, to this mutation, right down here, we pass comma and pass here invalidates tag, and inside an array we pass this transaction. So anytime we click on this add transaction or add the transaction, the API slice is going to call this method automatically. You don't have to worry about anything. And at the end, I'm going to copy this and pass that right here. Save the changes, save all the files, back to the application, and as you can see, you have your house rent transaction. Let me add one more. If I buy some stocks, and if I click on savings, investment amount is going to be 150. When I click on make transaction, you can see I'm going to have 3 transactions and 3 labels. That's super easy, right? Now, as you can see, we have here 2 duplicate labels. I want to remove 1 duplicate label from here, as well as I'm going to specify percentage to these labels. And inside this history, when we click on this delete button, I want to delete that transaction. So let me first show you how you can delete this transaction. So now when we click on this delete button, I want to delete this transaction. To create this, we need to back to the list.js, and right here, as you know, we have this list, and when we click on this button, I want to delete that current transaction. To do that, at the top, let me first create the handler function in the parent. Instead of creating handler function inside this child function, we create the handler function in the parent. I'm going to say constant handle click is equal to, pass here arrow function like this with the event parameter. Right down here, I'm going to say console.log e.target. I'm going to get the targeted element inside the console. Just out of that, I'm going to copy this handler click, and to this transaction, I'm going to pass here handler is equal to, and in the object, I'm going to pass this handle click. Now make sure you have this handle click before these statements right up here. After that, you can access this handler inside this child component right here. And then to this button, you can pass on click event, and you can pass here handler, this parameter. Save the changes, back to the project, and now when you click on this button, you're going to get the targeted element as a response. You can notice. Now when you click on this icon, you'll get this box icon response. So what we are going to do is, to this box icon, I'm going to pass ID. So when we get the ID of that current transaction, we can delete it very easily. So to this box icon right here, I'm going to pass data ID is equal to, and in these curly braces, I'm going to pass category dot underscore ID. As you know, with these categories, you will get the ID parameter as well. So I'm going to pass that here. And if you don't have value here, I'm going to pass empty string, something like this. And now just out of that, to get this data ID, I can just simply pass here dot dataset dot ID, something like this. Let me save this back to the application and reload it. Now when I click on this button, I'm going to get the ID of this transaction as a response. You can see we have different ID to these transactions. And now I can pass these IDs to the delete request and delete this transaction. Let me show you how to do it. So I'm going to back to my list.js right down here. I'm going to say constant delete transaction is equal to, I'm going to call API.use delete transaction mutation. And using this delete transaction function, I can delete the record. So right down here, I'm going to say if we have e.target.dataset.id, if we don't have that, then return 0. Or I'm going to call here delete transaction function with an object, and with this object, as you know, we pass ID parameter. So we pass here ID colon e.target.dataset.id. Super easy, right? Let me save this back to the application. And now when I click on this button, this will automatically going to delete the record from the database. So if you open this transaction and refresh it, you can see you're only going to have 2 transactions, right? So you can easily delete your data using this button. Now just out of that, let me show you how you can add labels and pass the accurate data to this Doughnut. Now once you understand how you can connect the transaction and the history to the backend, let's take a look at how we can create labels and this Doughnut. So what I want, so we are simply going to get the total sum of these transaction and calculate the percentage of it. Let me first add 2 transactions here. I'm going to add here by stocks, and I'm going to put this in the savings because I don't have saving here. You can notice if I add 500 here, let me click on this make transaction. So now I have saving. Let me add one more inside saving. If I add electricity bill, then I'm going to add that in the expenses. And now if I add here $100, and I'm going to click on this make transaction. Now you can see right now I have 4 transactions inside this history, as well as I'm going to have the duplicate labels inside this label section. So what I want to remove these duplicate sections and calculate the total sum of the categories. I'm going to back to my project and open the labels.js. Here you can notice I'm getting the labels inside this label file. So if I print this label, if I say console.log data, let me save this, open my console, I'm going to get an array of object, and inside that I have all the transaction data. Inside this first object, I'm going to have amount, color, name, type, and ID. Now what I want, using this data, I want to calculate the percentage. So what we need to do is we need to first get the total amount from every section, or you can say from every categories. To do that, I'm going to create a new folder here inside this source, and I'm going to name that folder helper. And inside this helper folder, I'm going to create a file called helper.js. And inside this file, I'm going to create my helper functions. So I'm going to just first create here export function get labels, and inside this I'm going to get the percentage of each categories. to calculate percentage and to get sum of total categories, I'm using a library called Lodash. Using Lodash, you can use many useful functions. So we need to first install Lodash. So I'm going to back to the expenses tracker, enter into client, and I'm going to say npm I for install, and I'm going to say here Lodash. When I press enter, this will install Lodash library inside this React application. So once I have Lodash application, let me clear the screen, close this terminal. At the top here, I'm going to say import Lodash. I'm going to specify here underscore from, in the single quote, I'm going to specify Lodash, the library name. Just out of that, here inside this get labels function, right down here, I'm going to say let amount sum is equal to, and inside this I'm going to get the total sum of each categories. So instead of creating the total sum inside this get labels, let's create a new function for that. So I'm going to say here export function get sum, and to this get sum I'm going to pass transaction variable. So when we call this get sum, I'm going to pass the transaction data as a argument. Now inside this, if I call console.log transaction, let me save this, back to the labels at the top. Here I'm going to say import, in the curly braces I'm going to say get sum from helper.js. If I print this get sum right here with this data variable, when I reload the browser, you can see I'm going to get all the transaction data. Now just out of that, I'm going to put this get sum inside this is success right here. So we will not get any undefined message, right? Something like this. So now once we have this data, from this data, what I want to get total sum of investment, expenses, and savings. So to do that, I'm going to back to the helper.js file right here. As you know, inside this transaction, we have the data. So I'm going to just call here let sum is equal to, and call here Lodash library. And in this parenthesis, I'm going to pass the transaction. Just out of that, once I have the data, I'm going to chain different functions here. So I'm going to say here group by type. I'm going to group the data by type, and then I'm going to say here dot map, and in the parenthesis I'm going to say object and key, and I'm going to call here a callback function, and inside this I'm going to just return objs, this object. Now just out of that, make sure you call here dot value, so you will get value inside this sum variable. Let me copy this, and if I print here console.log sum, when I save the changes back to my browser and reload it, you can see I'm only going to have 3 arrays, and inside these arrays, inside this first array, I'm going to have type investment. You can see inside the second array, I'm going to have 2 records of the same type, which is expenses. You can see here, right? And in the third array, we have the type of saving. Now once we have this array, I want to get the sum of each array amount. So to do that, I'm simply going to call sum by method of Lodash. So I'm going to first say here return Lodash, then pass here dot, and then call here sum by, pass here objs, the object, by amount, the property name. I want to get the sum of the object by amount. Let me save the changes back to my application, and when I reload it, you can see I'm going to get the total sum amount as a array. Now we get the total sum, but you might confuse which data belongs to which categories. So what we are going to do is I'm going to pass here another parameter, because from this get sum function, I'm going to return the array as well and the object with properties. So I'm going to pass here another parameter, which is type, and then I'm going to say here if we don't have type variable, means if we don't specify any value here to this type, then return this array. Otherwise return object with type property, and then I'm going to pass here key. Then I'm going to specify here color. I'm going to specify objs 0 dot color to get the color value from the object. And then I'm going to say here total colon underscore dot sum by, and here I'm going to say objs object, and we need to get the sum of amount, something like this. Let me save the changes, reload the browser. Now you can see you're going to get the same result, but if you pass here second parameter, for example, if I pass type here, let me save the changes, reload the browser. As you can see, I'm going to get an array of object. Now you can see here the type is investment, and you will get the color as well, and the total amount of investment is 300. You'll get the same result for expenses and savings. Now once you get this data, I'm going to just return that from this getSum function. So I'm going to simply say here return sum, because inside these get labels I want to calculate the percentage. So I'm going to first say let amount sum is equal to, I'm going to call get sum, and then I'm going to pass transaction here. Now because inside this function we don't have transaction, so let me pass here parameter transaction, and then as a second parameter I'm going to pass type. So we can get this object as a response from this get sum. After that, once I have this object inside this amount sum, let me just calculate the percentage. So I'm going to say here let percent is equal to, pass here underscore, and I'm going to pass amount sum, this variable. Inside this variable, as you know, we have array of object. Just add that. Right down here, I'm going to say dot map. I'm going to iterate over that array of object, and then I'm going to pass here objs. I'm going to return the object with percentage. But here the problem is, when you calculate percentage, you need the amount of your categories and the total amount of your all categories. So what we have to do is, before executing this map, we have to get the total amount of all the categories. So I want to get the total amount of all these three categories. So to do that, I'm going to say let total is equal to underscore dot sum. So I'm going to call Lodash dot sum method, and inside this I'm going to say get sum and pass the transaction here. That's it. As you know, this is going to return only array, and inside that array, as you know, we have different values. So this is going to return the result something like this, and I'm going to calculate the sum of all these values. So I'm going to get the total sum of all these values inside this total variable. Inside this map, I can simply say assign method of Lodash. So I'm going to say Lodash assign, and inside this I'm going to say obj. I'm going to call this object, and then I'm going to call here comma and pass here object. And then inside this object, I'm simply going to say percent, and to calculate percent, as you know, we wrap everything in the parentheses, and then I'm going to say 100 multiply by objs dot total divided by the total amount. So to get the percentage inside this property, I'm going to just multiply this total value by 100 and divide it with the total value. So inside the percentage property, we will get the percentage. Just out of that, just down here, we call value. And then at the end, we return percent. So once we get the percent, let me save the changes back to the labels. And instead of get labels, right now, I'm going to call get labels. And I'm going to call these get labels right here inside the console.log, right like this, back to the browser and reload it. Now you can see I'm going to have array of object, and inside this you can see I have a percentage property, and this is the percentage of each category. Now just for that, we need to pass this data to this map. So instead of this data, I'm just going to grab this function and pass that here. Something like this. Back to the browser and reload it. You can see I'm going to get the percentage of each categories. Now just out of that, let me just remove all these floating values. So to remove it, just back to your label component, and instead of just data.percent, I'm going to wrap this inside math dot round function, something like this. Let me save this, back to the browser, and as you can see, I'm going to get the proper percentage of each section. Now at the end, I want to pass this data to this Doughnut. Now, once you understand how you can create these labels for this expense tracker application, let me show you how you can pass data to this Doughnut. As you can see in the project, if you open the graph, we specify the hard-coded values to this configuration file, and then we pass this configuration to this Doughnut. Instead of doing this, I'm going to remove this hard-coded data from here and pass this data from the database. So let's see how to do it. I'm going to first copy this complete object back to the helper.js right here, minimize both these functions. I'm going to create a function. So I'm going to say export function chart data, and then I'm going to pass here transaction as a parameter, so we can get the transaction data inside this parameter. Now just out of that, let me paste that object right here. What I want to get data from the database and pass values to both these properties. So as you know, using getSum, using this function, you have the total sum of every categories. So what if you pass this getSum to this data? That will make sense, right? That will pass the same data you have inside your labels. So at the top, if I say let data value is equal to getSum transaction, I'm going to get the data from this parameter, and if I pass this data value instead of this hard-coded value like this, so this is going to return the data from the database, and we get the array as a response, and then we pass that array to this data. Now just out of that, I want to pass colors as well as an array. So to get the colors, you know that I have color property inside this transaction. So we get the color from this transaction and pass that to this array. So at the top here, if I say let bg is equal to underscore, I'm going to call Lodash map, and inside this, if I pass transaction and call the callback function something like this, and from this A we get the color. So if I return just the color from this map, then inside this bg I'm going to get all the colors as a object. Let me show you. If I console.log this, console.log bg, let me save these changes, copy this chart data in the graph. If I call here at the top, import chart data from single quote dot forward slash double dot forward slash specify helper and call the helper file, and from this we are going to call chart data function, and I'm going to call this chart data function right here. And to this chart data, as you know, we need to pass transaction data. So instead of calling this chart data right here, let me copy this code from labels. If I copy all this code, paste that in the graph right here, get rid of this transaction. If I specify here graph data, change all the variables as well to graph data like this, comment this statement, and at the top let me call this chart data right here. Inside this is success, and as a parameter I'm going to pass data, this one. I'm going to get this data from the labels, right? So let me save the changes. Oops, I think I misspelled something here. I'm going to get API is not defined. Now because in the label we have this statement, let me copy this in the graph. Don't forget to import the API slice. Let me save this. Now when I reload the browser, as you can see, I'm going to get all the colors inside an array. Inside this history, we have 4 transactions, and each transaction represents a color. So as a response, we get all the colors of each transactions. We have the duplicate colors inside this transaction. You can notice we have 2 duplicate colors here. So what I want to just remove these 2 duplicate colors from this array and pass this array to the Doughnut chart. So in the helper right here, as you know, we just console.log this bg, and inside this bg we have the array of colors. So if I say bg is equal to Lodash unique, I'm going to call a function of Lodash which is unique, and if I pass here bg, this previous value to this unique, then this is going to return a new array to this bg. And now if I save the changes and reload the browser, you can see we have only unique values inside this array. And now I can pass this array to this configuration. So instead of this array right here, I can pass bg, this variable. As simple as that, right? Now just for that, what if the user want to specify their own values to this configuration? As you know, we are using this configuration object inside this chart data function. What if the user want to specify their own configuration to the Doughnut chart? In that case, we can allow user to do that as well. So if I pass here a parameter called custom, and right down here, I'm going to say return. If the user pass the second parameter, then return that parameter or return the default configuration. You can see how easy it is to return the data from the function. If the user want to customize the configuration file, he can easily pass data to the second parameter and return that. And now once you have this configuration file inside this chart data, now you can pass this chart data to the Doughnut right here. But what I want to execute this Doughnut only when we have data. So I'm going to uncomment this statement, something like this, and let me get rid of the code from here, and I'm only going to return this Doughnut when we have the data inside this data variable. So I'm going to cut this Doughnut component right from here and pass that here. And to this Doughnut, as you know, we have the configuration, so I'm going to get rid of that and pass this chart data. So I'm going to cut this function from here and pass that here. As you know, this function is going to return the configuration object, right, with the backend data. Let me save this file and let me copy this and pass that here. Reload the browser, and now you can see I'm going to get the accurate data. The 43% is the saving. So you will get this 43% bar inside this Doughnut. You will get this 30% bar for the expenses and 26% bar for the investment. Now just for that, let me show you how you can display the total value. Getting the total value is super easy. We'll just back to the helper.js, minimize all the functions, create a new function here, and I'm going to say export function get total. In the parenthesis, we pass a transaction, and then I'm going to return underscore sum of get sum function, and I'm going to pass here a transaction. That's it. This is going to return the total amount of all the categories, and then we have to just pass this get total inside this graph. So if I import this get total right here, so let me first remove this object right from here, because now we get this value from the function. And just out of that, let me just first show you the result of this get total. If I say here console.log get total with data, save the changes, as you can see, I'm going to get here 1150 as a response. So you can just call this get data right here. And if we don't have anything, if this return nothing, then we return 0. As you can see, I'm going to get the total amount of all these categories. And now let me reload the browser and test this application. If I add investment, if I buy some stocks again, I'm going to select the type investment, and if I buy $150 of stocks, when I click on this make transaction, you can see the data is now updated, and here you can notice the investment is now 35%. Now let's suppose if I remove this salary from this history, you can see the salary is in the investment. You can see the colors. If I remove the salary from this history, you can see now the investment amount is 15% only. If I add the salary again in the investment with $300, when I click on this make transaction, we have 35% investment. And you can see we successfully created this MERN Stack application. Don't forget to use branches to follow along with me from different sections. If you find anything useful, make sure to press the like button, share this video with your friends, subscribe for more latest videos. That is all for now. I will see you in the next one.